There have been so many roster moves this offseason that it's actually gotten a little bit frustrating for me. It's gotten a little bit hard for me to keep up with who's a free agent, right, versus who isn't, who's a restricted free agent, who's an unrestricted free agent. Is this rumor true? Is this rumor false? What players have re-signed? What players haven't re-signed? At this current moment, right, in terms of talking on players who have been made free agents, at this current moment, only 26 players are currently holding on to starting positions. And that very well has the ability to change from the moment that I'm recording to this to the moment that you're seeing this. But as of this moment, only 26 players are currently holding starting positions. To keep that in mind, that is only 54% of the league moving forward into next year, right? So only 54% of current starting positions are being held, and we have that much more still left to decide. And I guarantee that 54% that I'm talking about isn't all going to stay the same way either. It is going to be one player going from this particular team and relocating himself onto another roster. And along with that 54%, that is 43% of players who had starting jobs last year. So if we're talking about the CDL last season to the CDL currently in the offseason, only 43% of players that were in the CDL last season currently still are holding on to starting positions, at least as of right now. Listen, I want to talk on why we're seeing so many teams make players free agents, because it's caught a lot of people off guard. I think it's definitely caught a lot of people by surprise to see the vast amount of free agents that are being labeled out there. And I'll have to be honest, it also caught me off guard as well due to the sheer amount of players who weren't guaranteed. Now, I will give myself a little bit of credit in terms of thinking, and I'll give the audience credit as well. I'll give the whole community credit. No one really foresaw the 5v5 to 4v4 switch coming into year two, right? I don't think anybody was really aware of that possible thing taking place. So that is, for me, one area that I really want to kind of dive into. So kind of like while in the midst of the entire league is in the midst of changes, there are still a lot of unknowns, but I want to address why, right? Why are we seeing such drastic changes after year one of the CDL? And the first thing that comes to mind, and the first thing that really has defined a lot of these moves, is contracts, right? Of course, contracts, they now with franchising dictate things more than they ever have. Contracts have been a thing that have been starting to develop Call of Duty in terms of the most prior years, and now with franchising, there is no way around them, right? A very high majority of players coming into this year signed 1-year deals or 1+1 contracts. And for those that are wondering, what is a 1+1 contract? I basically broke it down a few segments ago, talking on why the importance of 1+1 contracts are, how they work in terms of kind of comparing it to regular season, how not only the player has an option, but also the franchise also has the option. So by that being the case, by having so many players sign 1-year deals, of course, there is now this interesting factor of both the player and the organization thinking, hey, what else is out there, right? For those that have followed Call of Duty, at least in terms of the past few years, if you used to watch it back in the day, we're talking like the 2010s, the 2015 era, that kind of timeline, you know that roster changes were absolutely unbelievable, not just from year to year, but from event to an event, right? It is the DNA of Call of Duty for players especially to want to relocate after a season. I've always heard the term that esports moves faster than regular sports, and that is the truth, right? 1 year of esports is like 3 years of regular sports. So by that kind of notion and by a number of other things, I think it is fair to say that the reason we are seeing so many of these is because of the contracts that players signed. And to go along with that, it also gives organizations an ability to readdress the market due to the impacts of 4v4. Are player salaries going to go up? Are they going to go down? How was year one? How does COVID affect things? A lot of things to talk about. And I think if you are a franchise, it is fair that if you're talking on a prior player's deal, you are thinking of a new one coming into this year, because in some way, it's probably going to be impacted. You're probably going to have less players on your team, and thus, I brought up the conversation not long ago, that then adds to this conversation of, do they go up? Do they go down? Where's player value at? That is what franchises are trying to figure out, and that's why a lot of contracts are still being extended, but also why many of them aren't. Now, the next thing, in terms of why we're seeing so many free agents out there, is 4v4, right? That is or I'll say this, one of the primary reasons for all of these moves. This particular decision to go from 5v5 now to 4v4 has changed up everything drastically, right? It's because of this transition. We are going now from 60 starting players, I should say, now down to 48 starting players. So that instantly impacts the entirety of the league. And a lot of people are under the impression that it actually solely impacts the players, but it also impacts the franchises involved, right? Because if you are looking at a pool of 60 players and now you're saying, all right, we've got 48 of them now, that kind of actually helps you, right? Because if you are a franchise, you are thinking about what other players could be out there, right? Because not only do the franchises in some ways have more control because of the non-expansion coming into year 2, the players as well also are going to have to figure something out, right? If they get dropped from their team, or if they're one of the guys who are kind of, on the bubble, if you will, they're going to have to make moves. And that could allow for franchises to get players that they otherwise wouldn't be able to get, right? And now, I've talked on it already before, but like I said, in Call of Duty, we see so many moves all the time. It is not a surprise that we're seeing a dramatic change with not just a year 2 of franchising, but also because of the 5v5 to 4v4 players' mindsets change, franchises' mindsets change. This mixed in with the value of each kind of player changing incentivizes organizations to want to try and make a refresh. Not only that, but talent, like I said, becomes more readily available to the market as well. With 4v4, certain players will be in the CDL no matter what. Because of their talent, it just depends on what organization that they're going to go to. Like I said, organizations now have a better chance at getting better players because of the non-expansion. So if you are one of the bottom barrel teams, right, on paper, we'll say that, you should be able to come away with a team that isn't half bad, right? We talk about the talent pool and Call of Duty. It has only gotten bigger as time has gone on. The reason why we're seeing so many free agents also is because the franchises, they want to try something else, right? Now, when I talk about free agency, it is important because this also applies to why we're seeing so many FA tweets going out there, right? Free agency doesn't mean the same thing in franchising that it did to pre-franchising. Something to consider here. Not every player that tweets out, hey, I'm gone, right? Hey, I am now a free agent. That does not mean that, or I'll say this, it doesn't mean the same thing that it used to. Previously, that tweet reads free agent. That means a player left an organization or an organization dropped a player. And we have to be very careful as well about the way that we title these things, because if a player announces free agency, that doesn't mean that the organization has dropped that player, because historically dropping means that it was the organization's decision, right? The terminology of how all of this works is very, very important, and it's very interesting kind of looking forward. So, like I said, free agency doesn't mean the same thing when it comes into franchising. Whenever you are making a player a free agent now, that most likely means the contract is over and the negotiations just haven't started yet. So for a lot of these guys, they very well could re-sign to an organization that essentially dropped them. It's not actually dropping, but I'm using that to kind of relate a little bit here. So if we're talking about a specific team, and I'm throwing out a random roster, let's say that Seattle, well, we'll go and bring this up. Seattle drops Apathy. They have the ability to re-sign Apathy. I don't know necessarily in terms of their roster decisions, what they're looking at, but if they have interest, just because they drop Apathy, which I'm saying drop, like I said, just because Apathy is now a free agent, doesn't mean that his ties between himself and the Seattle Surge are gone. It just means that it's currently not happening as of this moment. And I feel like that has contributed a lot to the mass amount of free agents, is that people are under the assumption that, hey, this particular franchise wants to get rid of every player. That may be happening, but a lot of the times it could be that they want to bring back a certain amount, and it's just because those negotiations haven't happened as of yet. Now, another reason why I feel like we're seeing so many free agents, and we're kind of narrowing down the list, is that teams learned from year one, right? The big thing that I talked about coming into the start of franchising was that year one was going to teach franchises a lot of things, because you have a lot of people, a lot of staff, a lot of money being thrown at an esport that a lot of them, I wouldn't say a lot, but a decent amount of them aren't familiar with. They are trying to test the waters. They are trying to figure out what works. And that is the reason why I believe that we saw so many roster changes coming from, especially the amateur side, was because the organizations realized, hey, my team isn't really working. We've spent a lot thinking that this team was going to work. It hasn't. Now let's try to go to the cheapest option available. And it kind of started to show that it worked. That encompassing with the game, that encompassing with a number of different aspects. I get it. But that is the reason why it continued to work. It's because franchises, it was a learning curve in year one. And now with this 5v5 to 4v4 transition, that obviously changes things up, but they are learning, right? That for me is a major reason why we're seeing all teams start to overhaul, is because all of them want to nail the rebuild. That's my last point, right? While we're seeing so many free agents, teams want to nail the rebuild. I think it was Merck who tweeted out, all of these teams are aiming at going big, and they all have the ability to do that because, like I said, of the amount of talent, but in combination with the fact that we are losing players but keeping the same amount of teams, that in general is going to help every team in terms of their competitiveness moving into next year. Not only do we, rather I'll say this, not only do we want to see the potential teams that could possibly form, it also increases what could be moving in from their prior season to the one that they're looking at for right now. Like I said, organizations see the potential that does exist out there in the market. And what I personally believe, and I have no 100% notion to believe this, but this is just what my personal opinion is, I think that we are going to see, especially as the offseason progresses, players are going to be willing to take less because they realize this organization is the only thing that keeps me from playing in challengers next year. And so I think that encompassing with the amount of talent that is out there, that encompassing with the transition from 5v5 to 4v4, you have the ability to get less players, you have the ability to get better talent, you maybe have the ability to get them for cheaper. I think all of those things that we talked about in that specific conversation right there is the reason for why we're seeing so many free agents. And that's the reason why I believe that this offseason is going to be one of the craziest that we've had in a very long time. It obviously already is crazy, but in terms of players going to different teams, maybe players combining for different rosters that we would have never imagined before, that is the reason why I believe we're seeing so many free agents. And I don't think that we're going to see something as crazy as this looking on toward the future years. I think due to Call of Duty kind of having a new title every year is always going to make organizations be iffy about certain players because, again, you're not playing the same game. You don't have that same reliability of one player transitioning to the next title. But again, I think just in general, those are the reasons why we're seeing free agents. I'm interested to see exactly what kind of forms as time goes on, but I do believe that this is going to be one of the last times that we had this conversation. I don't see a major free agent kind of pool this year that I don't think that we're going to have that for next year.